Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined this evening for a discussion about Ireland by GEARÓID Murphy. Hopefully I'm not absolutely butchering that name. And I'm very, very happy to have him here. It's been some time that I've been hoping to get him on, and we were prevented previously by technical difficulties. I have to apologize to him and to the audience. I'm still under a channel strike, which means that I cannot post links in the description. So I'm not allowed, being a naughty boy, to include links to anything outside YouTube. Oh, I'm hearing that there's a crackling buzzing issue. Let me go ahead and switch my audio. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, how is the audio now? Let me know.
I'll tell you, it's much better, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
So much for the expensive microphone. I seem to have a bad cable in there, which I'm going to have to get at later. So hopefully everybody can hear everything, and apologies for that. So I was unable to include links for Mr. Murphy, but I want to encourage everyone to follow him. I know you can do so over on Telegram. You can do so on Twitter. I'll give him an opportunity at the outset here to shill for himself and talk about things that he has coming up and share links with you. I'm also going to skip my usual shilling about my books and the rest because I want to have as much time to talk to him as possible. Basically, the idea this evening is to hear what's going on in Ireland because it's rare that it makes the headlines in the West. I just did in the United States and Europe and the rest, certainly in the United States, I just did a review of the news. And, there's just old things from back in November and December with rioting, a few pieces about Conor McGregor. I noticed that there's some sort of referendum or some sort of vote coming up on the role of women related to the Constitution, but hopefully we can learn more about that. So, GEARÓID, thank you very much for coming on. And do I have your name right?
Yeah, it's like GEARÓID, so it would be like GARODE, I think, phonetically, GEARÓID.
And
yeah,
GEARÓID. So first, emphasis on the first syllable.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
GEARÓID.
Indeed. Whatever works for you.
Welcome. Yeah, welcome, and thank you very much for coming on. Maybe say a few things about yourself to introduce yourself to everyone, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, yeah. My name's GEARÓID Murphy. I do various types of content. Most these days, I'm just a lot of tweeting, to be honest. But I have a YouTube channel that's not been used very much in the last few years. I've done investigative journalism. I've done live streaming. I post online. Sometimes I write Substacks. I've done a few Substacks. I think I kind of do dabble in a bit of some writing and on the ground stuff. We can talk about this in a while, but stuff like this, like live vlogging, like action stuff. The Dublin riots, for example. So I kind of I don't know. I don't. In a way, I'm a bit of a procrastinator and all of that, but and I kind of shift around doing different things, and sometimes don't do things for a while. But I do take pride in a little bit of variety. So doing those kind of having like explosions going on around me in Dublin, but then like sitting down on a effort post on Substack about Zionism or China or something like that. So I like to do a bit of everything. And thanks for having me on. I intend to get back to streaming more regularly, and I moved house recently, and I have all of my stuff set up. I've had it set up for a few weeks, and I always said that once I have my stuff set up, I'll stream. I'll have no more excuses, and I haven't. I've kind of let a week or two go by. There's been no good reason, and this is actually my jumping on point, I think, a little bit. To when you asked me to stream, I thought I have everything there. This is brilliant, and the setup is lovely. I wish you could see it now, but I'm sure you're the same way because you've streamed for a long time. I feel really comfortable and excited to do more. So that was a long-winded answer to who I am, but I think that should give you a general idea. Also, in terms of your framing of the discussion tonight, I don't want to overly lecture people on things that are happening in Ireland either. You know, it's like there are specifics happening here, but I think a lot of it is just may as well be happening in a US state or in Britain or in Australia. It's fairly interchangeable. It's not like you're speaking to a Chinese man about the political affairs of China, which are radically different and very unique. And you know, I can really wax lyrical about it and tell everybody stuff they've never heard before. You know, in the sense Ireland is the same as everywhere else, but you know, on another level, that I suppose makes it interesting too. But yeah, you know, I think I speak to what I know, but this stuff is all general as well, isn't it?
Yeah, depressingly so in a number of respects. But there are a few things that stand out about Ireland that certainly make it a bit different for me. One of those things, and I don't want to anticipate where you might be going with this. Feel free to take it wherever you like after these few remarks. But the first thing is that it does seem as though there's a very active group or very active groups of Irish people who do not seem to be willing to, go quietly into the night. As I mentioned to you before we got started here, I really do recommend everybody follow GEARÓID over on Twitter, because you're going to see clips coming out that you simply don't see anywhere else in terms of him forwarding things that are making the rounds. You know, people who might be running for office speaking from their car. Another one that I just saw was a how do you say it, a Gombeen, who was speaking to someone in a parking lot outside some sort of development where opportunistic migrants were being housed. So there's quite a bit of that that you can see that comes through on his feed. And it's interesting to me because it seems that there's a tradition of people saying not just no, but hell no, as we would say in the U.S. And when you have people like McGregor, Conor McGregor, coming out and sort of positioning himself as a part of all of this discourse, it's interesting. Another interesting angle that I hope I can hear a little bit more about is something I've always wondered about, which is how the Republic of Ireland, having carved its own sort of path away from Great Britain, how it provides an angle where European powers can sort of throw a wrench in the works for things that Great Britain and the U.S. might be wanting to do. I've never heard anyone talk about this before. Perhaps it's just crazy of me to think so, but I've always had sort of an impression that the European Union does things in Ireland in ways that may be intended to screw with the U.S. and the U.K. and their special relationship. But that's just a guess on my part. So anyway, a couple of quick points. A last one is that I know that there's an enormous Irish diaspora population in the United States, and that historically, some of them, particularly in cities like Boston and the rest, activities in the United States to raise money or gain support play a role in things. So that's sort of another angle there that I'd be interested in. But these are just guesses on my part. As I told everybody at the outset, I don't really know what's going on there other than what I see in Mr. Murphy's feed. So those are some initial thoughts. Where would you like to take this? What might you have to say about all that?
Well, that's why I'm happy to be talking to you, because you have a good mind for these things. Finding angles, like the Northern Ireland angle is north of Ireland, we say, is interesting. I saw a post from someone on Telegram recently about how, this is just one wrinkle, by the way, but how even if the Republic of Ireland, let's say, were to shut down immigration and get very tough on it, we have this complicated arrangement with the so-called Northern Ireland that it's a part of the Good Friday Agreement, which happened in the 90s, basically sort of stipulates this kind of free movement from the south into the north and from the north over to Great Britain. You can, it's complicated because it's kind of a middle region, right? People in the north are free to move up and down but over the border, And people from the north are also free to take a ferry over and back to Britain, because they're, technically speaking, according to jurisdiction, from the UK. So basically, if we were to hypothetically stop immigration in the south in some sort of populist uprising or whatever, there would be the issue of sovereignty, UK sovereignty in the north. So the UK would still be an open borders sort of state, and bringing people in from all over the world. And those people, basically any guy from London could hypothetically go to Belfast. And then the only way we would stop that person from, if we had a closed border, so to speak, our border would be within our own country. And so you can see how that becomes a complicated issue. You know, you would have to basically put either a hard border back on, which is a hard border across the entire country, which would cut the country in half, which would cause a war of its own, basically, and an inter-Irish war, like the Troubles in the north previously. Or you would have to reunify the country officially and just get the UK out of the picture. So there is a question of, you know, to do with immigration, it's which I hadn't seen raised before, as it's becoming a serious issue in the south, the idea of immigration politics, we'll say. Yeah, that's a strange one. Also, here's just another. I'll kind of just jump from one thought to another. You know, they talk about the demographics in the north, that allegedly Catholics were meant to be sort of growing quicker as a population, which set the scene that eventually Ireland would be unified because of the demographic thing, right? Eventually, the demographics is destiny. Catholics are growing at a faster number. Eventually, there'll be a vote taken, and Ireland will reunify. And the loyalists, the Ulster Scots or whatever in the north, would be outnumbered demographically. But of course, what you have coming into the north of Ireland now are a lot of immigrants in general, and there are many studies of Black and Indian and, you know, non-European and even Polish, actually. So some European, those immigrants in the north polled, the majority of them identify as British, you know, which is always the big question in the north. You're asking someone, do you identify as British or Irish, effectively? And when people immigrate to the north of Ireland, they, you know, for understandable reasons, right? Like in a lot of these foreign cultures, they tend to gravitate. They want to go to New York. They want to go to London. I think there's an identity with the bigger country. They're not interested in the parochial, smaller country. So I think you're, you know, maybe an Indian or an African immigrant, and this is a general statement, of course, who moves to Belfast as an immigrant will be far more likely statistically to identify as English or British, we'll say, than as Irish. And that's before they even, I mean, obviously they're really an Indian, but like in terms of where they have moved to, they will adopt the British identity before they will adopt the Irish one. So the basically Northern Irish politics is extremely complicated and head-wrecking, as is globalist third world migration. That's a complicated issue. It's something two of us are very familiar with. But to smash those two things together is a sort of chaos. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. There's a lot going on there. Another thing I've spoken of before, and any Irish person who's familiar with this will agree with me, that there's a strange phenomenon whereby if you live in the south, which I do, it's basically immigration is all around you. Like it's very far gone. But when you go up there, you don't really see it. And yet, if you go to England or to Britain, you see immigrants. Obviously, you Birmingham and all that, and all of that. It's very, very bad over there. But Northern Ireland, in the middle, is sort of much less affected. And again, there are immigrants there, but it's just the scale is palpable. And I'm talking about, you go to a town in the south, you see it everywhere, and you go 20 miles north to the equivalent size town on the other side of the border, non-existent border, but like the hypothetical border. And it just seems like Irish, or you know, whether it's loyalists or Republicans, it, whatever you want to call it, British Isles, Irish, people are it's like 95% easily. I've had a theory that they, as part of sort of the peace agreement and the Good Friday Agreement and in the 90s as well, people like Bill Clinton were highly involved in the peace process. It was kind of like the global elders and all of that came together to, solve the problem. It was like one of their little projects, and to create peace in the north in the 90s. And I think part of that, this is a conspiracy theory, but I definitely feel while they were in the 90s, they were talking about replacing Europe, Ireland and Britain and all of that. I feel like there was a carve out made somewhere in a meeting somewhere to say, I think the North has got enough going on. People have just stopped bombing each other and killing each other en masse and having mass protests and strikes and all of this kind of political chaos, identity-based chaos. So let's not fill the place with Africans and Indians over the course of 10 or 20 years, which is going to be a radical project of its own. Let's just let them lie for a while. We'll catch up with them eventually, but let it sit for a while. I think that's been part of it. Now, in terms of is Ireland used by the EU as a sort of a wedge against the UK and America, the Anglo-American Atlanticist Pact? That's a tough one. All I can do is kind of ruminate on it a little bit. I obviously don't have an answer, no more than anyone else, but there is a strong Irish-American Atlanticist connection too. Keith Woods tweeted about this a few weeks ago, kind of made a good point. There's a thing called Commission na Man, which is an Irish phrase. It's basically a censorship board that's been created to implement the EU censorship directive. I've forgotten the name of it. It's some online thing. And this was effectively cooked up by NATO and the US as a form of internet censorship that the EU is going to implement over multinationals like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And so Ireland is at the forefront of that. But, is that, I see that as a US thing more so than I suppose what I'm saying is that I see it all as the same thing. I see America as the hegemon in that, running the EU. I don't think the EU is sovereign from the US power structure anyway, to begin with. So I suppose that's kind of it. But Ireland is a key player. It's sort of a bridge between the EU and the UK. So we strongly identify with the EU. People don't want to say that, but there is a strong, like, the EU is popular in Ireland for various reasons. And with we have a sort of antipathy to the UK historically for obvious reasons. Not English people or anything, but there's just this kind of like state rivalry, I suppose, or issue. But here's another one for you though. The RAF are effectively the Air Force in Ireland. So NATO shills in Ireland are constantly advocating that we set up an army and that we join NATO and we do all of this kind of stuff, or we join the EU army. They constantly want us to militarize and join the Western Alliance officially, even though we're staunchly historically neutral. But what they always complain about, because the majority of Irish people love our neutrality, we enjoy it, we take pride in it, and it's the idea of militarizing in any kind of way is totally unpopular. But the NATO shill advocates, their critique of that position is that, well, Irish people love their neutrality, but the reality is that the neutrality is undergirded and underwritten by the RAF. Their view is that Ireland is protected. Every country has to be either protected or at least a head under the hegemony of another power. Like, if you're not under one power, you're under another. And they like to say that, well, hey guys, there's no airspace is a vacuum. Someone's going to be the dominant power there, and Irish airspace is dominated by or watched over by the RAF. Put it that way. If there were there were a Boeing 737 were to go AWOL and start flying around in circles and doing, barrel rolls in the middle of like the west of Ireland and threatening cities, there are secret pacts there, or it's not sort of official, but it's well known. It's an open secret that it would be an RAF jet scrambled. We don't have planes, so you know, I hate to say it, but Ireland is far from a sovereign country, and what we really are is a sort of a subject of the entire power structure. So we're sitting right in between the EU. Like if those are subdivisions of the EU, UK, American sort of Western alliance, we are this sort of funny little state in the middle of it all that operates as a tax haven, a shadow banking empire, a bit of a landing strip for literal US military in Shannon Airport on the way to the Middle East, even though we're meant to be neutral. We're protected by the RAF. We are a soft power arm of the EU. So I don't know, Ireland gets jostled around in between these powers, but I think it's all the same thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, it sounds to me certainly as though there's no way for me to come in and impose such a simplistic framework. From what you're saying, it sounds as though, you said you referred to the NATO shills, and it sounds as though they're making the same sort of side of their mouth nationalistic argument, the same way that Europeans would say, well, if we really truly want to be independent from the United States to escape its clutches, we need a European army, which of course would then, well, I mean, from my perspective, it would be very likely it would begin to subsume the constituent states of the European Union, and within a larger ever more federal structure, or more centralized. I shouldn't even say federal, the way things go in Brussels. But yeah, interesting, and thank you. But there's another sort of major angle on this, and I had meant to say it at the outset. I forgot. The first reason that I first saw you when you were doing a millennial one year, but in sort of following what you were posting and the rest, I was struck that you are very sophisticated in terms of looking at how activism can be done. And you were one of the few people I saw that seemed very, very sensible in terms of what sort of things you were recommending or suggesting to people who, I don't mean to suggest that you're a great organizer or that you're in any way responsible for what people out, on the streets do in any particular case, but you seem to caution people to approach things carefully, to document things carefully. And so, yeah, that was my first sort of exposure to you, which you could call sort of grassroots activism. Maybe it's more accurately described as the journalism, but you were very careful about what you would suggest and how people should conduct themselves, so they didn't get screwed by the various players out there, provocateurs and the rest out there. So one of the areas that I think a good bit about is what people in Ireland are doing about what's going on now, or and has been going on for some time. So perhaps we could move over to the subject of what is going on and why, first off, and then what the Irish people are trying to do about it. I noticed that some people mentioned in the chat, the major corporate headquarters, or at least regional headquarters in Ireland. If I remember correctly, Google's pretty big there. I'm pretty sure that Apple has a major center there. I understand that there are things, related to tax breaks. You mentioned shadow banking earlier. So one of the paths we could go down for imagining why all this is happening is that the corporate overlords generally like to have their diverse populations, prevent unionization, ensure that they can sort of balkanize labor forces that otherwise might be troublesome, make them very, very happy to have the job that they have, just generally to chisel away at homogeneity, so that citizen or labor organization becomes that much more difficult. At the same time, there's also the background of, which we would all expect, of simply diversifying the various nations in question to make them more generally and more broadly pliable or susceptible to manipulation. So those are a couple things that occur to me, but I wanted to ask your thoughts first on what is happening and why do you think it's happening? If indeed there are any other, any differences in Ireland. You pointed out that it's much the same, but, I wanted to ask.
Yeah, the differences are, the first obvious one is in regards to mass migration. I think that's always the central theme of what we're talking about. And I think that's reasonable enough because it is such a big issue. We're not being, blowhards. I think it just is the issue we always come back to. How could it not be? In Ireland, in regard to that, the scale is an issue because on this island, there's like 6 million of us. 4 million in the South, the Republic, or sorry, 5 million, but probably 1 million of those people are foreigners. So anyway, it depends how you count it, but like roughly a handful of millions of us. So, it doesn't take long, right? That's maybe a quarter of the population of New York City, probably, or somewhere there. So, I mean, we're talking about tiny numbers to begin with. And if you're bringing in, as we've had, hundreds of thousands of people annually, it doesn't take long. And if those people have family reunification rights, which entitle people to bring in dozens of people literally, and they often do, you can see how the numbers start to stack up pretty badly from there. On top of that, and again, this is not unique to Ireland, but I'll talk about it anyway. We used to talk about open borders in our circles back in the day. Open borders was the cry, the sort of sky is falling. We were trying to convince people that we would end up with open borders because our government were globalist and replacement migration and all of this. Hope that term is not going to get your channel in trouble. But open borders used to be the boogeyman. But in reality, it's far worse than that, as we have, and I know you have as well, but as we've had to a huge extent, much worse than open borders. Because if we had just an open border, because of the economic saturation, where housing and everything gets so expensive, and just everything, it comes to a sort of a natural equilibrium, where even though there's a lot, non-Westerners would like to come to Ireland because it's a nice place, it's a high trust society, it's decent, you can make a bit of money. They wouldn't be able to because they wouldn't be able to afford it. It's too hard to live here. They would decide to just live in maybe a not so good of a country, but their lifestyle is maybe better. The stress of coming to Ireland to work, 12-hour shifts and commute 2 hours to be able to afford a house, back and forth. And once you do, you can barely turn the heat on because the rent is so expensive and blah, blah, blah. They would sort of naturally ease off. The numbers would level off as the migration creates a economic crunch. The economic crunch tapers the migration, and it sort of, again, it finds its natural level in a funny way. You introduce asylum to that, and we're far worse than open borders. So-called asylum, the idea that you can just say the word asylum. There is absolutely no legitimate criteria upon which asylum is adjudicated. The wheels are complete. If they ever were on, they're completely off. You just come in, you say the word asylum, your NGO person tells you what to say. The whole thing is rigged and set up, and there are no, as far as I can see, the only grounds upon which you are denied applying for asylum and all the benefits that come with it in Ireland is if you are Irish. That is the only thing that would count you out. You could be a rich person from, let's say, Tunisia. I don't think there's any war there. You could be a wealthy person from Russia who is completely on the side of the regime, no political persecution, but you could still very feasibly travel to Ireland and claim asylum. You could be basically anyone. and claim asylum. You could barely even lie, barely even make up a story. You could show up and just kind of half-ass it and just say, "Hey, can I have asylum?" They say, "Where are you from?" You could say, "I'm from Albania," or no, let's do even better, Georgia, with Tbilisi is the fastest. Or no, Georgia is one of the fastest rising economies in the world. Tbilisi is safer than Dublin. There's no active war going on there at the moment. And yet that person can claim asylum. So they're basically the only criteria upon which they would, on the face of it, say, "Sorry, I'm not even taking your application," is if you said, "Oh, I'm Irish." That's that, or maybe if you were European, French or English, they would say, "Well, that's the one thing that I'm going to have to say no on. Anything else goes." So you have this sort of two-tier society, or this, dare I say, kind of almost apartheid or whatever. Not to bring South African politics and history into it, but what we think of as an apartheid, colloquially speaking, where one person is allowed to apply for effectively UBI. So you stay in a hotel room, you have the heat on all the time, you go to the sauna and the steam room. You probably, I don't know the details, but I think your laundry kind of gets done like in a hotel. In fact, I've stayed in hotels and paid hundreds of euro to stay in hotels when I was house hunting recently. I had to stay in a hotel because we wanted to check out a few properties and we have kids, so we booked a hotel to stay in the area for like 2 days. And so yeah, hundreds of euro for like a crap hotel. The price is completely inflated. And you're walking around, you're hearing Ukrainian, you're seeing like other types of foreign guys walking around, kids, and you realize, oh, this is a dual use thing. So I'm in a hotel, I'm paying a fortune. Meanwhile, it's sort of being used for asylum seekers as well. So effectively, they're in a hotel and they're availing of all the benefits of a hotel. They can work at the same time, which of course is exploited by greedy capitalist bosses and that. But they can work at a subsidized rate because they don't have bills. They don't have to pay for rent or a mortgage or any of that. So they can obviously work for less. Like even if they get paid half by the guy, that half is still more disposable income when all is said and done than it would be for you after you had to pay for your own stuff, right? So you have a severely two-tier structure where foreigners are coming in by the boatload, and getting effectively a UBI, a generous, decent UBI. Meanwhile, Irish people, especially if you're like reasonably middle class, like you're not poor enough to be on the sort of the dole or whatever, you know, the average Irish person then has to, of course, pay for everything. So, it'd be one thing if asylum was a few hundred people every few years or something, and it was like legitimate political, political prisoners and these kind of things or whatever, rare instances of like known famous cases of a political dissident or something. But obviously it's just and you know this, but like it's a mass migration system, but which is funded to a UBI standard, while the natives don't get funded at all and they can't say anything about it. And not only are they filling up hotels, but they're filling up military barracks, office buildings, schools, vacant schools, any vacant property whatsoever. I can't even think of them all, but there are many ones that would shock you. The different types that they will use. They're just filling them up with migrants, and of course, like I always say, we have an issue with trying to wrap our heads around this, because it's sort of like you get used to it. Like I said this on a few streams before. We don't have the words to describe it. We can just say, "Oh, there are migrants coming in. They're being put into these buildings. It's happening like that." But I mean, the magnitude of that happening at such a scale needs vocabulary that we don't have. We talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. We talk about World War II. Ideologies, or the killing fields, or we have this vocabulary to talk about previous regimes and extreme events and acts and phenomena and regimes and all of that. And we don't. I think we struggle with it now because it's not just sort of, oh, migration's gone crazy. There is something very extreme happening. And of course, by the way, the vast majority of Irish people, when polled, are against it. some of these centres are being, now whether this is provocateurs, whether it's really disgruntled local people, I can't comment on it. You know how it is. But on the face of it, buildings are being burned down, riots are happening. The Irish people, and vast majority, are against it. Like, the easiest thing for the state to do would be to say, okay, let's stop. A ordinary analysis, an objective analysis, looking at what's happening and looking at the regime, in the sense that, how do I want to gather my thought, or to express this correctly. Usually people will do the easiest thing. They will take the easy. I'm lacking the phrase here, but they will take the easiest option always. People will just gravitate towards that, especially politicians and these kind of people. They will just go with the easiest thing. And on the face of it, you would think the easiest thing, with all of the pressure at the moment, politically, these burnings, the unpopularity of it electorally, the political blowback, the chaos of it, the easiest thing for them would be to say, okay, we'll stop. We're just going to shut down the airports. Then you're going to love us. And they're not doing that. They're just ramping it up. So, like, we're dealing with something very nefarious here, and yet most people are still rabbits in the headlights. And yeah, we're highly censored and persecuted. So I don't know. That's a ramble.
Oh, it's goes a long way towards trying to figure out, what it is that's happening and why. We can only guess, but as they say, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a fucking duck. And you mentioned the business of requiring a vocabulary for it, and that's where it gets interesting, because as soon as you begin to stake out linguistic territory, your semantic fields that deal with the different things that we face, well, that's where hate speech comes in, and that you also discover that there's the way I refer to it is we have receptors, so to speak, the way you have neurological receptors in the brain, chemical receptors, and they fit a slot. And so I think, as we all know, there's a certain way they ensure that whatever slot that might be filled with a term that would be more accurate and descriptive, with a positive valence for what you would wish to do, they ensure that receptor is, instead of homogeneity, peace, lack of conflict, social cohesion, trust, they ensure that receptor linguistically, to drag this metaphor out, is filled with, for example, ethnic cleansing. If you were ever to do what would be necessary to have high social trust, cohesion, these sorts of things, well, wait a minute, our receptors are already full. We know what that is. That's ethnic cleansing. So there's the negative, the negatively charged vocabulary that's already in place and is being enforced. And then there's the power of the state that comes down on you if you begin to coin some new terms or whatever. I was worried at first that I would get in trouble for using the term Gombeen. I had to go look it up after you mentioned it once, and I found it a charming term that seems to be appropriate. So yeah, they have ways of these and many other ways that we're all familiar with, that they circumscribe your actions, your movement. They attempt to circumscribe your thoughts. So it seems fairly clear what's happening, although we're forced to speculate and indulge in what they like to call conspiracy theories. I like to think of conspiracy theory as just a term with which they've replaced allegation. It's much more convenient to call an allegation a conspiracy theory rather than to take it seriously as an allegation. Just another example of the same kind of, same shit, different day. But coming around to how the Irish are dealing with it, with the stuff that happened, I guess it was November, I imagine, November, December, when the rioting was happening. I can't remember exactly. But it really did break out you know, from the outside, it seemed all of a sudden, and it seemed that it was very widespread. And you know, from the outside, we see, you know, I grew up seeing movies where Brad Pitt played some IRA guy who fled to the US. You know, in the United States, there's a particular type of, we have our own little narratives that got propagated about what happened in Ireland. I'm not foolish enough to think that any of them are accurate, but there's a very strong sense that Americans have of Irish people as being people who will be pushed up to a certain point, and then they will say not just no, but hell no, and fight about it. You know, and of course we have all the things about, you know, being redheaded and having a temper, and you know, Celts who like to fight. So I don't know how true all of that is, because on the other hand, historically, you know, the Irish have been hammered and abused for centuries, you know, but it does seem to me, nevertheless, that there are people who really will mobilize. And it's not that far back in Irish history that they, you know, you had your Michael Collins and people like that, you know, you had an actual war going on. And it was without much in the way of resources. My old friend Tim told me a story once about how some IRA guy had been sent to shoot up some British secret police officer or something of this sort. I can't remember the details, and this might just be an apocryphal tale, but it's illustrative of having to fight without much in the way of resources. Apparently, the guys came in on the target when he was in a cafe or something and shot him full of holes, and there was a newspaper headline about it that says, you know, like, British officer riddled with bullets. And the way the story goes, these guys came back later to their operational headquarters, and the old dude who's in charge of them ran around like smacking them about the head and shoulders and shouting at him saying, riddled, we don't have that many bullets, you know. Sorry, my one chance to tell this crazy story. So anyway, the point is that it would seem that the Irish would eventually get to the point where they're like, fuck no. And it did seem for a bit that they were beginning to reach that point with these riots. What are your thoughts then on the reaction to all of this? When did it appear? Did it really burst onto the scene out of nothing, or had it been growing for some time? Has it been growing since? Has it wound down? What's happening?
Well, it began in. I'm the type of person who, you're asking when the riots happened, November or December. I can't remember. I'm terrible with this stuff, right? I just categorize everything into somewhere between a week ago and a year ago, and I don't know, you know, that type of thing. And then once I get into which year it is, I'm totally lost. So I think it was late 2022 when there was East Wall, a part of Dublin. A video came out of people getting bussed in, and that kind of went viral, and there were massive protests there. And from there were hundreds of more local protests across Ireland against these centres being put in, these plantation centres, as I call them. But or, you know, it's kind of gone from there. Then there have been several burnings of those centres. I'd say there have been like 10. They say there's been a lot more, but I think there's probably been like somewhere between 5 and 10, let's say, proper ones, but for the NGOs and all of that, of course, you know, I've no knowledge or no advocacy or any of this. I'm just an analyst watching it just the same way everybody else is, obviously. But just caveating any, you know, bullshit there. But yeah, there's probably somewhere between 5 and 10, maybe, proper ones. So we're talking about large buildings, very large buildings being, basically, some of them were counted as fires, and there was a little fire lit at the front, and it was not really anything like a small little fire at the door, or, you know, accidental and like diagnosis of a fire where there really wasn't one and stuff. But there were somewhere between about 5 and 10 proper ones, by which I mean large buildings being burnt, razed to the ground. And of course that attracted police investigations and all this kind of hype in the newspaper about the far right and this and that. And you know, it's interesting, nobody's been prosecuted for any of that. They say arson is a hard one to investigate anyway. due to the nature of it. But so I don't know. People have different theories on what's behind it, but let's just say it is disgruntled locals, the most kind of obvious one, or theory. Yeah, it's interesting. There were councillors, these are normie political councillors, like local politicians in Galway, where one building was burnt to the ground. And these politicians stuck with the local area even after the fire. They said, listen, I don't condemn the area. I don't know who did anything with a fire, but at the same time, I'm not going to run for the hills just because of the fire. I stand by the people. We don't want these people coming in here. This shouldn't be happening. They weren't cowed into sort of being goody two shoes after the fire. They just said, listen, I don't know anything about that. I condemn fires, but we still stand strong against what's going on. And these councillors ended up getting very based, in a sense. They're members of mainstream parties, and they basically ended up saying, fuck the party. I'm standing with the people, and I'm not cooking out in not in so many words. And one of those guys was raided at 6 o'clock. This isn't a far right streamer. It isn't any of that. This is a normal local politician. Raided at 6 in the morning. All of his phones, everything taken. I think his wife's phone, family, all of his phones, the house phones put in a bag. And and he complained afterwards. Of course, he said, like, they could have called to my door at any time. They could have phoned me. They decided to do a no-knock, a type of, or maybe not no-knock, but they raided the guy in the wee small hours. So you have that going on. You have a lot going on. I mean, there's a political activist / journalist / he's running for election now, Derek Bly. He at one point he made a point of going to this charity shop, like a thrift store in Cork City, and it was allegedly for Ukrainians. This shop, everything was free or something for Ukrainians only. And he said, this isn't fair. You could have rich Ukrainians, which there are many of them, driving around in Porsche Cayennes and whatever. He said he made the point to say, well, this is discriminatory. So he took a little beanie hat worth 20 cents, nothing. He took it and he said, everything in here is free apparently for Ukrainians, but that's discriminatory. I'm taking this hat. And the Gardaí or the police, I don't know the full details if they quite raided him, but he was brought through court. I think they seized a lot of his stuff. They put him through the ringer anyway because of that. All sorts of little things like that. There are loads of cases where the police have gotten sort of tough on it. There was one in Rosscray, this kind of small town in the middle of Ireland, where people formed a line in front of this hotel. Like they set up a camp and a fire and barbecue, and the whole local area rallied. Local businesses brought wood and brought food and everything. It was a real town effort, almost like a festival set up outside this proposed migrant hotel. Effectively a blockade, really, of the hotel to make sure none of these migrants were put in. And in this small little Irish town, maybe 50 to 100, I'd say, riot police showed up, stormtroopers, right, fully decked out, and basically pushed and beat old, like, regular people. And there were Irish kids there were grannies, there were mothers. They just pushed people out of the way. So, like, it has gotten to the point of hardcore police state now. It's still controversial to be against migration. Like, you have to be careful in polite society and all of that. But in terms of, so it's one of those things that everybody's a bit afraid. You're not going to shout it from the rooftops, but in polling, it's 70-80+% of people are against it now. If you speak to anyone in private, secretly, everybody's against it. Like, the narrative has gone, is gone. Like what a few years ago were people like me rambling on the internet, trying to make a point to a small minority of people who were into it, but the majority of normal people had no time for this sort of crazy talk. Whereas now it's not like that. Everybody knows we're being replaced. Someone mentioned it in the chat a while ago when I said I was looking for words. I said we don't have the vocabulary, and they said the vocabulary is population replacement. I mean, it is, but the problem is
You're
that
only
that's what.
allowed you're
Yeah,
only allowed to
well,
say that if it's in a UN paper, and it's spoken of in positive sense.
yes, if you're for it, then it's true. If you're against it, it's a conspiracy theory. But it's like the population replacement begs the further question of more terminology, which is the vocabulary I'm saying we're lacking, or we don't have, is that it might be population replacement, but why? What is the overarching point of this? And the other words I was looking for, someone mentioned in the chat, was path of least resistance. That's the simple phrase I couldn't find a while ago. On the face of it, you would think politicians and all sorts of people in power in this country would, the path of least resistance would be to just stop the migration, more or less slow it down. And yet they can't do it. Of course, people then answer that and say, "Oh, I have the language for that. It begins with J, or whatever, right?" And the trouble is that analysis, going back to World War II and the ideology and the cosmopolitans, Zionists, all this kind of stuff, right? Is that I'm not like rubbishing that. Of course, I know the theory on that, and it's not missing the mark too much. But of course, you also have. There are it's a confluence of factors. There are many factors coming together. You could say, oh, well, it's profiteering, it's kind of capitalism run amok, it's all of these different things. But again, we're still missing the language a little bit, because you have greedy capitalists, effectively, ironically enough, in China too. You have them in India. Think of like somewhere like India. You couldn't think of a place that's more exploitative of its population, or perhaps China, and more willing to use people and to generate profit at any cost, and the low value of human life, and the low social capital or political capital, like of honesty and decency. Like, it's not like these places are bastions of human decency, and yet they don't have that level of antipathy within, and political structures to replace the population. And of course, in such a rapid period of time as well. This is a rush. This is happening in a rush. So there's something very strange about it, the speed at which it's happening as well. It's almost like, I don't know, I wonder sometimes geopolitically with Russia and the multipolar order or the unipolar order ending, there's something there which brings the ruthless cosmopolitans and the capitalists. All these different theories come together and are interesting and have relevance. But overall, there is something to do with some sort of coming apart of a unipolar or the Western hegemon, and there is some sort of mad dash happening for some reason right now, and we're getting into the fag end of it, as George Galloway would say, the late stage of it, in my opinion. But I ramble. So yeah, so someone path of least resistance. Yeah. So basically, my question always is like, the path of least resistance would you would think would be to stop all of this, but it's not. So how do you explain how increasing it for the traitors and leaders within our societies, somehow they see increasing this in the face of the popular resistance, they see increasing it as the path of least resistance somehow. You know, it's almost like, in Lord of the Rings, when they get into the mountains of Moria, in the first one. I hate to do this, but they get in there, and it's dark. Most people have seen this, so they get in there and it's dark and scary, and there are all sorts of creatures that are, I think, coming at them, and they're sort of looking around and scared in this dark place. And I think at some point they're being attacked by these smaller kind of creatures, and then suddenly all of those
The
things run away in
Balrog.
the up. Yeah, and they go and they look and they kind of look. They're happy to start with as these things are running away, but then the Balrog. So it's like, oh shit! Like, what must be making these things run? And it's like, that's what I wonder about. What makes these people see doing all of this as the path of least resistance? I suppose you could say it's money, and the ability of the Western Alliance and the US kind of empire to print money and just kind of throw around blue ribbons, or sort of checks, blank checks for their chosen comprador elites. And maybe that's it, the ability to just use surplus value within society to sort of buy up a certain, but then, you know, again, the question is why. Look, I'll stop talking for a while. I think I'm just kind of rambling at this point.
No, I think that it's a very important question. It's just one that we have to hypothesize about, in the absence of, anything to go on other than speculation and, what's out there in front of us. It seems very, very clear that the elites at present are busy, lining us up in front of a ditch while we dig it. And we're left to wonder why we're digging this long ditch that we're standing out in front of in the morning, and what comes next. So from that perspective, you can see where the populations involved would not be cheered by this process. They would want to push back against it. So it has to be, there's a bigger stick somewhere else that applies to them. And, I believe in it's human nature that you would get people to move towards the carrot and away from the stick. But it's important to remember that there are probably sticks that apply to the individual people at the top that can be wielded with much more specificity. There's all the talk about the things that happened with, people like Epstein and the rest, and the way in which it's likely. We hear it all the time about Hollywood, no idea if it's true, but, that people are required to compromise themselves in some fashion before being allowed in. And that makes perfect sense as far as I'm concerned, because celebrities have enormous power. The way that human beings operate, we recognize the face. I get into etymology and the rest, and noble comes from the same roots as known, to be known. It's the same reason why, rulers and leaders would impress their faces upon coins. So their image literally would be the currency. And so when someone becomes a celebrity, they have power in that respect. And so they need to be controlled, which means, install the, like the sci-fi movies where they put a chip in their neck that can blow up if they, make the wrong step. It seems as though something like that would be present. I don't mean literally that they have chips installed in their neck, mind you. And as long as I'm talking all kinds of wild and crazy shit, I should emphasize that despite the fact that we've talked about as a matter of the discussion, we just have to cover it, fires getting set and the rest, or populations pushing back. None of us can or indeed do endorse violence. We're not suggesting that people should go out there and become violent. We're just discussing what's going on in these various places. Anyway, just wanted to make sure that was said explicitly, for my lords and masters and their AIs. So it would seem that when people rise to positions of power, whether they're celebrities or not, they go on a list, and how they vote and what they do is monitored. And I think there's certainly enough evidence out there that we can see that it is people within our own cultures and societies who are responsible for it to a considerable extent, like the Gombeen. But there are also people from outside, and there's one particular group that everybody likes to hammer on, and I think there's certainly overrepresentation there, so there can be little doubt about it. But likewise, I think that it suits our enemies' interests as well, very much, to cause problems. So just because people within our own countries are doing it to us, I see no reason to just out of hand dismiss the idea that Chinese, for example, or Russians could see it as being a windfall for them that they can exploit if they didn't have a hand in creating it in the first place. A lot of the leftist stuff going on in the United States in the early days was explicitly Maoist. I shouldn't say the early days, but the 60s. I mean, you could carry that shit all the way back to the 1890s if you wanted to. Anyway, yeah, it's I guess this falls under the rubric of why again. And that's something that we have to just sort of, speculate upon. But in terms of the reaction within Ireland,
Mhm.
perhaps you can tell us about what people are doing. For example, I see a lot where they're just people going out into public, like the one you posted recently with the Gombeen guy who kept telling the dude who was talking to him that he didn't have a job. And when the guy said, "Yeah, I do have a job," he's like, "Well, where do you work?" Wanting to bring the hammer down on him. And there's another one you posted with a guy who was going to be running for some sort of local office, I believe, or already had it, and he was in his car talking about what was going on. And I don't see as much of that happening in Britain now, though I have seen it in the past, and it's certainly not gone. But with like the kind of things that have happened recently with Sam Melia, which I'm sure you've heard about, everybody has and should know about. It seems like that they're doing their best to just shut that shit down, and to make sure that people are afraid, and they don't take action. So one question for you would be, in addition to what's happening there, why is it why is it you think that the Irish aren't just shutting up? Is it just their nature not to shut up?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I'm guilty of that anyway. But like, there's a look at the Boston busing riots in the 1980s. Those were Irish. During the BLM chaos, one of the famous videos was Irish people in Fishtown. I think that might be Boston. I don't know. One of these, fack off sort of, whatever that accent is. I love it. But they they told some Antifa. I remember the guy specifically, these real like thuggish like looking Irish guys. They said one of them said, "Get out." He said, "Take that." I don't know if you remember the homophobic slur F word. He said, "Take that F word energy." He said, "Yeah, get that F word energy out of here." And they basically dragged Antifa out of it, and shut down their neighborhood and wouldn't let these militants and BLM and Antifa militants in. So I don't know. Clearly, there's a culture. The reason I point that out is because that's not in Ireland. It's just Irish people, and yet they exhibit the same tendencies. Let's say. There's just
I grew up around them in the south of the United States. I'm
oh, yeah?
familiar with them. There's characteristics. Half of
Hmm.
the jokes that they tell down south about, like, they say, what are the famous last words of every redneck, and their variants of it. One of them is, "I bet you I can." Another one is, "Hold my beer," or another one is, "Hey fellers, watch this." So yeah, it's it's a part of the bio spirit.
Yeah, there's some sort of there's something going on there, but I don't know. It's you also saw in Liverpool, like even in the UK, insofar as there have been something similar to what's happened in Ireland. It was in Liverpool, which is known
Oh
for
yeah, and
being
my
full of Irish people, and
my friends tried to explain to me a Scouse is like at least half Irish, and I had not
oh
been
yeah,
aware of that.
yeah. So it's such an Irish kind of place. Even the vibe there is very Irish, but so there's something. Oh, and it's just it's a historical thing. Like I don't like to wax too sort of lyrical about it because who knows really, but there are the 800 years of the colonization and the kind of resistance. So a lot of the qualities that are needed now to resist this, they're not, you know, they're the kind of qualities that were selected for over the course of 800 years. So you had the mass rock, you had all of these kind of things where like the religion, the Catholicism was banned, the language was banned. Padraig Pearse, the 1916 revolutionary, he famously said, they have one half of us bought and the other half intimidated. They think they've accounted for everything, but the fools, the fools, the fools. We have this long history that almost seems like it was written in retrospect by me as a fan fiction, to sort of as a historical lore that would be the grounds for inspiring us to rebel or to push back now in some way. And yet it's real. It is just our history. It just so happens that even the fact that I'm sure you've noticed we've been using the term plantation, because of the famous Ulster plantations originally, which is how the whole north of Ireland thing got going. Ulster Scots being put in the north by the British regime, and to effectively colonize and ethnically cleanse the territory. And of course, with that came the attempt to wipe out the language and the culture and all of that. So it kind of speaks to our current situation quite a bit. Funnily enough, as well, the plantation, here's just some numbers for you. Between 1550 and 1650, I might be 5 or 10 years off, but basically 100-year span from the mid 15th century to the mid 16th century, there were 125,000 Protestants or Ulster Scots planted in the north of Ireland. And that's what we consider the Great Plantation, effectively. There were a few rounds, but that's just to give you an example. Within a 100-year period, there were 125,000. And now the Irish population was pretty big back then. I'm not sure what it was in the 15th century, but Ireland is known for we're one of the only countries in the world that has a smaller population now than we did like 200 years ago because of famines and all of that. So like my point being, back then the population wasn't necessarily tiny either. And 125 was counted as a plantation, a historical event that we talk about 500 years later, as having a long-lasting impact on the country, nearly tearing the country apart and nearly wiping us out effectively in the long run. And we're having more than 125,000, that number. We're having more than that annually now. And it can't even be argued that it's migration. Oh, it's just migration. It's just a phenomenon. Because, of course, they are being planted. The term is not misappropriated or misused, because, I mean, you don't have to be an activist like me or a journalist to say that. Of course, they're being planted. The government are taking them through programs and literally putting them on buses from airports into literally barracks and hotels, and it's all systematized. So if the plantation doesn't apply there in the same context, it doesn't have any meaning. It's not a stretch at all. So we have, speaking of the lack of vocabulary, to some extent, we do in Ireland have the vocabulary for resistance. We have it within our history. It is replete with that. And so I think it's in our history, it's in our culture, and it might be in our DNA as well, to some extent. And of course, we're raised on that too. And moreover, Ireland is very clannish. People will be very careful to not rock the boat, maybe on the surface, but deep down, they're always ready to close ranks, and that's how I see it. And I don't want to speculate too much. I don't want to go like, don't want to name that person, but like Americans who've written books about potential ethnic conflicts. You probably know who I'm talking about. That, like, I don't want to write a hypothetical what's going to happen war novel here, but in events like that where there is definitely turbulence coming, and these kind of clannish towns in Ireland would be very quick to close ranks around their own little tribe, and that is there always, and it's not going to be beaten out. I don't care how many people they bring in, that will always be there to some extent, and that sort of metaphorical fight, we'll say, is there. And I don't know, I'm sure you've noticed this from like my posting online. There are a lot of videos of different activists popping up, going up to places and doing this kind of doorstepping politicians and doorstepping security, or going up to security guards and arguing about the plantation. And there's so much. I don't see that in somewhere like Canada so much. Like, just not to pick on them, but like
no, not so much.
You just don't see that like energy, or and Canada's great in a lot of ways, and they have a lot of cool activists and stuff. But just in terms of what makes Ireland cool is that, like, it's not all activists. I don't really do that at all. It's I reshare videos that pop up of just normal people having their moment. Um, it's among the people. It's not a set of activists. We don't go out and do some sort of political action where we're doing the action and everybody else, just the normal population, are just not involved. It's kind of the other way around. It's the normal population who are doing all of these things. Take this Ross Cray or all of these different towns that have done their resistance. Some of those people might know some of the stuff I'm saying, and there's always going to be a handful of them who are following people like me and others, and have, are in, like, they sort of get the plan, they understand the whole agenda, and they understand the dynamics at play. But for the most part, it's just ordinary people in the town just kind of spontaneously and naturally getting it. And they might be a little bit confused, but they do get it. And I don't know. So what it is, yeah, it's a good question. But and then the other aspect of your question was, how is it happening? How is the sort of pushback manifesting? And I think
is
it is just that.
developing? Can you see
Is
a
it developing?
trajectory?
Oh, it's a good question. Perhaps, yeah. There's an element of, like, constantly protesting things in real life, blockading, and then pushback from the state and back and forth. And it's kind of like, we could do this forever, and they're always going to kind of have the upper hand. Like, we're always just going to be kind of shaking our fists at them and kind of happy with ourselves. But that's not really going to go anywhere. I think there is an electoral future. I think within the next few years, we're going to have politicians, whether it's local councillors or TDs, which is like MPs basically, or we're going to have various levels of politician elected, some of whom will be sort of shills, right wing shills a little bit, but some of whom won't be. Some of whom will be as genuine as you or me, or anybody else, like proper, like diehard, like true believers in what they're doing, and not professional politicians or opportunists or anything. Just so you're going to have people like that who are in political positions, and of course that's a beachhead. Once we have also European MPs, so that's a big position. I got one guy is running for that, and even if currently it doesn't work out, they don't quite get the vote. If it's not this one, it'll be the next one or the one after. There is the groundswell that's happening in Ireland will bear fruit in terms of political candidates. So, like, if every town in the country has had this kind of plantation drama of police beating them up, and councillors who going AWOL and joining our side, and eventually the whole country just becomes saturated, and the kind of things you and I are saying to each other is just behind closed doors, absolutely commonplace in Ireland, boring almost. From that reservoir, you can definitely run based people, and there's a reciprocity there, where that person is going to a pool of a population who are completely ready for that message. So you could have a whole suite of people, and like I say, if you get a few people elected, you get some clout that way, you get some access, you form incoherent, sort of slightly unofficial blocks, which I think is going to happen, instead of it becoming like the nationalist party or whatever. I think it'll just, right now you have a lot of independent politicians who aren't joining anything. I personally kind of like that. I like, for as long as we can, keeping it diffuse and keeping it vague. That way, some people are co-opted, some people aren't. Nobody knows, and it creates a certain amount of political chaos and uncertainty, and a sort of almost like a breeding ground for change, which is better to me than establishing a Tory or a Republican sort of opposition. It's better to have a simmering environment,
And
where
amorphous. Yeah, it's very difficult to
yeah,
cut the head off of something that doesn't have a head. Yeah.
yeah, and so I think that's going to happen. I think people will start getting elected, and then you're going to have people who are the real deal, um, in power, effectively, in various ways, and they will be. Then, when there are further protests, instead of the instead of there being a sold out politician in the local area, which there currently is, let's say in any given area, there's just some, rat politician. So the local population are doing a protest, but they're either being ignored by the rat politician or they're being sort of sweet talked by him, but really led down the garden path. And he's really on team regime. So that's kind of a problem, is that you have like this headless chicken, this big local resistance, but it's either a headless chicken or the chicken has a head, but it's like a antagonistic head. In future, what you will have is the groundswell, the resistance, and the local politician will come from the protest movements. So they themselves will be completely real deal. And so they won't be playing ball with the police. I say this in legal terms, right? In the sense that they won't be saying, okay, hey, well, I'm going to be a good boy. I'm on team regime. Like secretly, I want these people cleared out of the way, and we'll sweet talk them and we'll put them back to sleep. And, we'll get this thing through. You'll have someone who says, no, I'm not dealing. Like when the regime come to him, he says, I'm not dealing with you. I'm with them all the way. Like this is, gloves off territory. And so, that's the future. It, even though it feels a little bit aimless sometimes, I think the environment, the pool at the moment is fertile and rich for things to come out of it. And every protest, like I always say, every town that gets planted and where the resistance sort of fails ultimately, the police beat people up or there's some subversion, that's a major red pill. You have an entire area, not just that town, but towns for miles around that whole greater area have now been spending weeks online looking up. Let's say I'm in town. Let's use the town Rosscray, for example, one of the recent ones. People who would normally be disengaged are now watching a video I'm making about that town. And they don't know me, but they see some guy is talking about the town. And so they're into it. Now they're hearing about population replacement and this and that and the other, NGOs and regime. And they're hearing all these kind of words. And they're learning about how to reject the guilt complex, how to reject all of these little mental traps. They're learning is the word. They're getting a strong, quick, fast education in this stuff. And so, yeah, they may have been defeated on the ground. The migrants went to the hotel, but look how these people are now mentally in 3 years' time. You have a radicalized population effectively everywhere. And so where that goes can only be a good thing, I think, in the future. We'll see.
Yes, let us hope, of course, that it is civil and lawful. But yes, resistance within that framework is salutary.
Can I just say as well, is that like the whole thing about like we disavow violence and all of that? Sometimes people say that in this kind of glib way where they're like, it's kind of like a funny joke almost, to say it's like we want to cover our asses because of course we're not involved in anything, but let's cover our asses. But like it's kind of glib or whatever. But someone's asking me why my hair is black and my beard is red. I don't know. It just happened. I've been asked, do I dye it? No, I don't. Anyway. That's a side. Sorry, the chat does distract. But on the point of sort of the question of political violence and civil political resistance, or the distinction between those two things, I don't like when I'm not glib when I say like we don't have any interest in that or we've no association to that. It's true, and more importantly, we don't need to. To my mind, the most radical thing you can do isn't really a violent act anyway. It's the most radical thing a person can do, in a sense, is become politically and morally liberated within themselves. And I think that the regime probably recognized that as true too. The idea, because I've had many experiences where people in a town totally fold, and they're totally radical for a day or two, and then they fold when the newspapers arrive and call them racist, and they just don't have it in them. They don't have the bottle for it. And I think the idea, or they're willing to sell someone down the road. Oh, he's the real far right, or this kind of stuff, right? And that basically creates complete disarray within a resistance movement. That kind of falling apart. So the most radical thing a person can do, and a population or a movement, any sort of resistance movement, small or large, can do, is establish a sort of moral righteousness and a willingness to suffer. So to say, for example, someone is put on the spot to say, sell him down the river and maybe you live to fight another day, right? And now we're not talking Braveheart where people are hung, drawn, and quartered, but the modern version of that is, oh, you're going to be called racist. Maybe there'll be some newspaper article where your name is included. You might get fired from your job. You might get told that your kid who's on the local football team, you might get kind of nudged out and told you're not welcome here anymore because I heard the newspaper said you're racist, or any kind of modern version of an ostracization or a fear of suffering or loss of income. For someone to say, I don't care, bring it. We're not for turning. It's not going to happen, and we're solid. That when I talk about radicalization, I don't mean radicalization like some violent act or some sort of warfare or whatever, physical, kinetic. I mean radicalization where the person is basically off the reservation, morally and politically within
Off the
themselves, and
plantation.
off the plantation, as a community, and as a person individually, and all of that, where people say, I'm off the reservation. The idea of polite society, respectability, the idea of acceptance from this higher order power structure, all of that, I am now off the plantation. It doesn't mean I'm a lunatic, but it just means that I don't abide by that anymore, and I don't seek it. And in fact, I seek the opposite. The last thing I want is to be a member of this order or this structure or this respectability, this fake respectability from like newspapers and certain power institutions and all of that. There's a radicalization in that and that's really what you need, is to get people to a certain point where they understand that to push back will require a certain suffering and struggle. It's nothing too bad. It doesn't have to be that bad, but you will. It's a sort of a complex thing, and it's the thing you have to see to get. But I've seen so many times where towns will say, we're in this for the long haul. We're going to fight back all the way." They say that on the first night, and all is good, right? Rush of blood to the head. We're in this all the way. I'm not leaving. I don't care. We're going to beat this evil government doing this terrible thing. Then the next day, there's like a newspaper article on Facebook saying people of the town may be racist, and there's a political subverter at the top, and this and that, and they just fall apart, and they say, I cannot handle this. I just want it all to go away, and they fold. It's you wouldn't think so, but people who think they're in it for the long haul cannot handle it when the heat even turns up to dial 1. And it's just, you need to get people to understand it. I just think through long experience, through repetition, they eventually start to get it. I've seen a few cases of that in Ireland where basically the show has come back to town for like the second or third time with another centre in another hotel, and by the time they're on their like second or third go, people are like, they're finished with it. They know you cannot negotiate with the state. They know the state isn't reasonable. They know that ordinary political leadership will just lead you astray. They know what NGOs are and all of that. And so, yeah, that's what I mean by radicalization. And I think it's far more powerful than anything else. All this stuff about criminality or whatever. It is more powerful. Also, it's in terms of violence, the only violence really is from the state. We don't need a violent movement to necessarily win or to be able to have influence or succeed. They are the ones who need violence. That's what we've learned.
Yes.
By maximizing our political opposition, we have forced their hand into violence many times now. And so that's where we've pushed them. So in a sense, having to come to violence, having to resort to that, in a sense, is sort of a defeat. In a way that you don't have an argument, you don't have anything to offer. If they, which they will end up doing, their ability to initiate and do violence against us, when that hits a wall, this whole thing falls apart. If the police weren't enforcing this actively all the time, our problems, we would sort it out tomorrow morning. It would be done. There's enough social capital in this country to sort it all out, and all common sense solutions as well. Nothing crazy, we could totally retake our country reasonably peacefully. They are the ones who bring in the violence, and not us.
Yeah, and I would add that, of course, it's the state and state-aligned organizations that have shown consistently that they need violence, and so they will send provocateurs to engage in violence. I'm not saying that there isn't spontaneous violence as well, but the state requires it, which is why they will send people into the midst of crowds to do it in order to create the spectacle that they desire. By contrast, you don't see the state sending out agent provocateurs telling people in towns at the pub that they need to free their minds because afterwards their ass will follow. The very things that you're talking about as being fundamentally necessary across the population to make a strongly enunciated no possible. Those are the things that they want to shut down. They don't even want you to use the words. They want to shut down the networks. They want to identify the nodes. They want to remove people's ability to propagate a message. I mean, for fuck's sake, many people are reduced to putting stickers on lampposts, and then they get, picked up, even though none of it's illegal. The intent was nasty. You're just an asshole. You deserve to be in prison, whether a law was broken or not. So the thing that they are most concerned about, that they attempt to thwart, to mitigate, to suppress, you get a sense of, when you're over the target, metaphorically speaking. Whereas the violence is something where if they don't get it, they're going to send people in to introduce it. So I very much agree with you. I mean, I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't engage in self-defense, legitimate, actual self-defense. And, when everything breaks down entirely, you want to protect yourself, your family, your loved ones, the people you live with. But, if you have a family, if you have children, and no one with any sense who does is eager to get involved in pyrotechnics and bloody violence in the streets at all. And generally, when you have people who do endorse that sort of thing, I haven't been able to scan the chat much to eject anyone who speaks in that way. Hopefully, I noticed Lady of Shalott is in here. Very good to see you, Miss Lady. She's got a wrench. I hope that she will make sure that such people are not running their mouths in here. But yeah, I agree with you. And so, yes, let it be noted for the record that we're not just posturing when we talk about a desire to avoid violence. It's in fact the wisest course in all but a very few circumstances, and those involve lawful self-defense. So one of the things that came to mind is existing organizations that come down to the Irish people through history as having led the struggle once upon a time. I noticed some comments made about it in the chat from what I've heard for quite some time now. Sinn Féin was basically leftists, Marxists. I don't know a great deal about it, but that's one of the first things that occurred to me. A lot of people in the United States who don't follow these things, who don't know much about this, they think, oh, the IRA or, Sinn Féin is going to show up and sort this out. Can you tell everyone who doesn't know about this? I don't know much about it. What's really going on there? Do those organizations exist, still exist? If so, do they still have the best interest of the Irish people in any sense in mind? What's going on there?
Yeah, well, it's kind of complicated history. There are all sorts of eras. You like Sean Russell, commander of the IRA during World War II, actually died en route in a Nazi submarine. I think he was smuggling weapons, if I'm not mistaken. But, there was a pro-German element within the IRA. And then you have all these different branches, splinters of IRA. It's like, which IRA are you talking about? So it's a complicated, long-winded history, which I don't even claim to fully, you would really need to be a subject matter expert to have like a full, on the tip of your tongue grasp of that. Even Irish people, generally, don't. I mean, we get the general idea, but there's it's almost like a joke, you know, the fact that there are so many splinters of the IRA. Like if you do a little tree from like maybe the early to mid 20th century, it just splits and splits and splits and splits into all these different real IRA, provisional IRA, this, that, and the other.
It's like Baptist churches in the South. We have a joke.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
say,
yeah.
no Baptist church too small to schism yet again.
Pretty much, actually, yeah. And then, of course, all the MI5 infiltration, or is it MI6? One of those. But yeah, so it's a thoroughly like messed up sort of thing, the IRA. I mean, it's kind of like, what even is that? And they've had movements of being Marxists and all sorts of different things. Like I say, there was a Nazi sort of sorry, I shouldn't, that's a word, that's a trigger word, isn't it? But like the other N word. But yeah, so it's gone back and forth. But the point is, now they are the Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA traditionally, but now are a legitimate mainstream political party. Disconnected from the IRA for a long time or whatever, supposedly. Yeah, they're just a cooked out globalist sort of party, you know. They could have been something great. They could have been amazing had they stuck to, hypothetically, had they stuck to real like real nationalist politics, which they kind of could have for a while. I mean, they could take every seat in the parliament now. What's happening to them now is they are falling apart a little bit. They could have become effectively the dominant governing party, where they're not even co-governing with anybody else. They just have an absolute majority and they can ram through whatever they want, almost like a one-party state, which would be pretty cool if it were the right people. Almost like the guy, El Salvador guy, just a complete walking away with it. What's his name? Yeah, Bukele. He legitimately got, you know, like 80-90% of the vote. So basically him and his supporters can just do what they want. And they have a mandate for it. Sinn Féin could have had that level of power if they were anti-migration within reason, but they just went down the road of appealing to globalism, institutions becoming mainstream, all of that. And they became very popular, and now they've hit a wall, and their support is sort of falling apart a little bit. They will still be one of the big parties now, but it's hit a ceiling because, you know, nobody else is interested now. People are annoyed that they haven't taken on the immigration issue. It would have been very natural for them to take it on, but they didn't. In their manifesto, they say, officially speaking, they say they're against mass immigration and they support a reasonable immigration policy. It's like a little line in their manifesto, but in practice, they are constantly counter signaling, calling everybody racist, being pro open borders. You know, it's a bit of a mess, but so they're just like the others, effectively. So we are just like any other country, starting from scratch. You know, we have some smaller nationalist parties and all of that, real ones, but yeah, we're starting from scratch. I do see a lot of Americans will say, oh, you know, they see like some sort of migrant violence, and they're like, oh, get the IRA on this. Where are they? And you know, it's a cool idea. The idea that you would have this hardcore sort of release the Kraken sort of you know, national Kraken that is just sitting there in a box waiting to be unleashed against anyone who touches a hair on an Irish head. You know, that would be wonderful, but it's just not like that. That's a footnote in history now, effectively unrelated to the current political goings on. Yeah, so I think we're just in the same position, you know, as like an America or a UK in that sense. This is a new thing, kind of unrelated to any previous dissident or whatever you want to call the IRA. We don't have that.
Right. Yeah. And I learned very, very early on not to make jokes with Irish people in bars. And I learned also, or to be very careful in doing so, because I ended up with a beer all over me after I said to a Irish woman, lie back and think of England. You would think that, you know, I would know better. Yeah. And also trying to get into details about what's going on there that I know nothing about, really nothing. And it, and many Irish people have said that to Americans in my hearing too. So it's not surprising to me that you say, I don't even want to wade into what's what with all of that, because, who knows? Yeah, it does make me think though, that the song needs to come back. There's an old Clancy Brothers, Tommy Makem and the Clancy Brothers song that always seemed like it was just dying to be revived in a different context. Whatever you say nothing when you talk about what. For if you know who should hear you, you know what you'll get. They'll take you off to where, for you wouldn't know how long. So for whose sake, don't let anyone hear you singing this song. And I thought that would fit quite well with censorship and hate speech and all the rest, but perhaps it's best left to the side.
Well,
I did
the
want
whole
to ask
thing. Oh, go ahead.
well, I want to hear what you had to say, but and so forgive me for interrupting, but I wanted to ask about the church as the next point. I suspect I know exactly what you're going to say, because it's what's happened to churches everywhere. But
well, just about whatever you say nothing. That whole kind of keeping it stum. We have smartphones now and the pervasive surveillance. That's one of the differences between now and back then. The surveillance state, in an Irish context, some of the attitudes back then of like resisting, spicy resistance. It's different now. People can't even think without being seen. But in regard to the church, I just they're a complete non-entity in terms of this stuff. I mean, the Catholic Church, it's just like anywhere else. It's completely redundant on these things, political matters, let's say, and even on the social issues, I think they're not to be found. I mean, they're great people, some of the trad cats and people I know personally. Um, some of the best people will be revolving around the Catholic Church. But they're quiet. They're in the pew, quietly. Or maybe there's the odd priest here or there. The friend of a friend tells me he gets it, he's okay. But as an institution, complete non-entity politically for our purposes now, unfortunately. And just like they don't even whatever about migration, just these social agenda, the abortion referendums and gay marriage and all of this stuff, they're completely non-existent even in those debates. They don't stand up for anything. Now, it's a pity. I wish they were strong. I wish the Catholic Church was proper tradcat and anti-liberal. Like, I would love to see that if they would be a bulwark against the regime. That would be fantastic. But I think that's one of the problems as well. I'm sure it's like that where you're from too. That traditionally all of these institutions, it could have been sport, it could have been church, it could have been very farmers, alliances or whatever, some sort of like almost like unions, trade unions, various things like little sectors within society that would be used to be sort of their own thing and would be a resistance block against any regime activity. They were strong in their own right. I feel like everyone now is kind of on the state teat a little bit. All of these lobby groups, trade unions, everything is subsumed into it. The church is subsumed into it, politically speaking. They're subsumed into liberal sort of the liberal view of history and the moving onwards of the next thing, transgenderism or whatever. They're just in step with that. So I don't know. It's kind of sad, in maybe a few decades ago in Ireland, there was what the state says, but then just kind of what the church says. The church is pushing back against the government doing something, or the GAA, which was the sporting body, Irish sport, might have its own thing to say. And the women's, the Monona Heron, there used to be these various women's organizations, and the IFA, the Irish Farmers Association, was seen as a massive lobby not to be fucked with, basically. And they genuinely were independent from the state. The state kind of had to play along with these guys, but I mean, I think they're all bought out now, just like kind of NGOs. it's like everything receives a big check from the state and is bought in, and they're not a power center of their own. So that's the church for you. But yeah, it's all grassroots now, no institution whatsoever in support of us.
Well, here's an interesting angle then, or one for me that I at least need to ask about. I've been paying attention to MMA for quite some time, because you see people like Dana White, and I'm not proclaiming here that Dana White is in any way based, but he has been appearing with Trump, and I'm not hereby saying that I'm claiming Trump is based. I'm just saying that he's willing to take a position that, to whatever slight degree it is facing off against some of the things that are being done. And by the very nature of the sport, it kind of has nationalism built into it, the same way that that international football matches do, the same way that boxing does. Tyson Fury is going to fill an arena, certainly if he's boxing in Britain. Somebody like Conor McGregor has a huge number of Irish fans, when he was fighting, that would travel to go see him do so. And we've seen things like this fighter, Sean Strickland. Maybe you noticed him. He was an American MMA fighter who was being vocal about certain things. And by the same token, the MMA stuff is interesting as well, because they're some of their biggest name fighters, and the ones who fight the best, arguably, at least given their records, are from the Caucasus, which is in Russia. And so here you have an international sporting body of some kind with a very high profile that has not shut out Russian athletes. So again, I'm not claiming that this is in any sense necessarily proof of anything, other than the fact that we do see that this organization and the fighters involved with it have a tendency more towards nationalism because of the nature of the thing. They're resisting some of the impositions on speech. I think it's disgusting that they've got women beating the shit out of each other as a spectacle for us. But there are positives and negatives there. But I did notice there's Conor McGregor, who has emerged and said some things that I don't think, looking from the outside, were counterproductive. And then there was someone else, I think that I saw it in a clip you posted. There was another Irish MMA fighter who was getting politically involved, a much less well-known name outside Ireland. I can't remember the details of it, but, I wanted to ask you about that. These figures like Conor McGregor, sports figures in general, and perhaps specifically Conor McGregor himself. What are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, it's a few thoughts. Like one of the you notice the UFC are like open to the what did Dagestanis, people like that, or Russians, and they have Sean Strickland saying stuff about transgender issues and being like anti-PC, and Chad, tough guy and all this. But yeah, there's this whole network, Barstool, I don't know what his name is, the guy who runs that.
Yeah, the Barstool Sports
they kind of
guy.
Brand Barstool Sports, yeah, the guy who goes around eating pizzas on YouTube. I forget his name. He's I'd say he's a fan of Israel, put it that way. But that sort of world is interesting, because it's kind of like bratty and bro-ish and anti-PC. They don't want any of this woke stuff and all of that, but there is a heavy influence of the likes of Ari Emanuel and people like that, like this kind of you saw Kid Rock talking about how like Gazan children should just be killed or whatever to free the hostages. Like there is an element, there is a sort of a little poison pill within that, like tough guy sort of anti-woke sort of cultural alternative, which is largely through the likes of MMA, some stand-up comedians, Shane Gillis, Theo Vaughn, all these there's this whole kind of culture. But the problem is that people like Ari Emanuel kind of have it by the balls a little bit. So it's a bit awkward. There's a tension within that. Now that relates back to Conor, of course, because he's an MMA fighter, but you know, he's a force all of his own as well. I wouldn't claim that he's beholden to that much. I mean, he's certainly an influence on him, surely, these kind of higher up execs. To some extent, they might have influence on him, just like every other. There are many influences. He has his drinks company. He has various things like that. So he is he's doing a great job in a sense, because he's going very, very far with his what he says. You know, my point on Conor is to just say that, you know, he exists in a bigger context of the entertainment industry and fighting and business and all of that, and yet he is such a big figure that he has a sort of a gravity all of his own, I think, as well. He's a bigger thing than Sean Strickland or, you know, Shane Gillis or whatever, Kid Rock. I think, and especially within an Irish context, because it's a small country, he is, you know, he's a little larger than life. He is the natural, and these are strong words. I think he is the natural king, effectively, of this country, in a sense. He has got the savviness, the political knowledge. He gets what's happening. I have no doubt about it. He understands it as well as you or I do, or better. He has the ability to talk, to be fast, to be combative, to fight, literally, to be successful in business, to be charismatic and charming, all of these kind of things, all of these qualities. And he is a true patriot. He is a lover of Ireland. I know he is. He's from a working class background, and he's always chafed against this kind of stuff. And I've been watching him for years. His likes, who he follows, all of this kind of stuff, who he associates with. I know the little details of these kind of things, and I know he's, you know, and I get DMs from not from him necessarily, but from other people of influence in Ireland. You know, people will tell you, like, you know, I know what's going on, and I don't think there's a better man for the job. I mean, think of the gravity of something like leading a sort of resistance to what's going on. What you would need. I'm not cut out for that. I know I'm not. I'm a good talker and activist and all of that kind of stuff sometimes, but it takes a lot more than that to actually, you know, when the rubber meets the road, to actually balance, to be moderate, but to do what's necessary, to strike balances, to be reasonable, to engage in big events. Just to think of something as simple as his big fights, let's say his Floyd Mayweather, these massive fights the whole world is watching, to walk into the octagon and to fight like that, to snap your leg in half in front of the whole world and just, you know, take it on the chin. He's seen the bright lights. You know, I can talk about it, but I think if I were under some bright lights like that, I would probably fall apart, you know, because I've never been involved in something as big and as epic as that, even though it is really just entertainment. He has seen it all. He's been around the block, and then he gets it. You won't find someone with all of those characteristics in Ireland. You know, how could you? So he is perfectly placed. So I hope he gets into politics. He was talking about running for president. These kind of things are complicated, but whatever he runs for or doesn't, he is a political figure in Ireland, and I have a lot of respect for him. You know, he tweeted, "Ireland, we are at war," the day before the goings on in Dublin. You know, I mean, serious stuff, and he's got money too, of course. So I don't know. You know, I think it was right of you to bring it up. I said we don't have any institution on our side. I think Conor McGregor almost counts as an institution more so than just a person. So actually, we do. We have him, and that's a major thing.
Right on. Well, then there's some hope in addition to the native truculence, the native unwillingness to, you know, it's that whole, you know, don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining, you know, and I would have to imagine that the Irish are very, very well aware of how to make that distinction. So I certainly hope that that it continues to grow, that this reaction continues to grow and moves constructively towards the ends that matter, you know, rather than getting dragged off by shills and provocateurs and all the rest of the sad clowns that get mobilized to screw up any kind of nationalist movement. Well, we're coming up on the end, so I wanted to ask you if there are any final words you have, any closing ideas. You know, you've got these people listening, quite a number. You brought in this may well be the most people watching any stream I've ever done, just for your awareness. So you got quite a few people listening, and you know, what would you say to everybody about what's going on in Ireland?
I could go on and on. There's a referendum on the 8th, so this Friday I think it is. I don't want to go deep into that, but it's about, this is just like not a closing thought, I suppose, really. But that's on the 8th. It's this kind of I might as well just throw this out there. It's about the role of a woman in society and the definition of a family. I don't want to get into the details, but it's a kind of a cultural inflection point, I suppose. We do these referenda every few years. We'll see, will that be rejected? Basically, the idea that abolishing the family formally, let's say, it's kind of been abolished in practice already, with various, you know, like 2 guys buy a child or whatever, 2 gay guys, you know, all of these various practices, or whatever, you name it. Like, the family's been sort of abolished. You can, you know, get a divorce, like click your fingers and get a divorce. All these various movements have made marriage, take gay marriage, these various things have made marriage into a sort of a, like a pinky promise or whatever, you know. It's at that, and a child can effectively be bought via test tube, via Ukrainian woman's womb, etc. In that sense, the family is in practice abolished or diminished. But I think a lot of this referendum would be kind of formalizing it, but I don't think it's going to pass. So for any Irish people watching, I didn't really get involved in this one, but you know, vote no on these things, just to kind of send a message that's just relevant to the moment. Closing thoughts. You know, the situation here is pretty bad. I'd like, on a different day, I'd love you to tell me about the States as well. I want to hear it. I don't want to always be talking about Ireland, but in terms of Ireland, it's I'm sure it's the same as the US and the UK and everywhere else, Australia. Like, it's kind of bad. Like, by the way, I know if you were wrapping up, I can stop. But if I can go off for a minute,
go ahead.
Yeah. So just to give people an idea of the level, I just want to tell 1 or 2 stories. So there's just one here, because it might sound like political waffling and you know, going on and on about the regime and systems and replacement and all of this stuff, but it's very real what's kind of happening, and it's sad too. There's one example here of a guy called Emmanuel Adeniji, African guy. He raped a bunch of old ladies in care homes. You see this kind of stuff happen across the West, and you know, that's the kind of thing that ordinarily wouldn't be happening. They're obviously native rapists, but the idea that you don't know who people are, you don't get them, they're from different cultures, they're not vetted by communities, you know, they're not known. You know, you also have a weird guy in a community, you just stay away from him. You don't let him work in the nursing home. He's creepy, he's a creep, you know. Don't, kids, stay away from that guy in the white van. There's an ability for communities to sort of keep people like that on the margins. But of course, when you bring these people in and the regime is corrupt, you can't socially vet these people. So you end up with scenarios like this. So this isn't just a foreigner by happenstance. It's a systematic conclusion of this happening, of this phenomena of mass migration. I just want to find some of the quotes just to let people know that when I'm talking about this stuff, I don't do it for the crack and I don't do it to entertain myself. I just want to find people a quote just to give people a sense of why we're talking about this. before we
Well,
wrap up.
while you're
Uh,
looking, I will add that
yeah.
people are always talking, and I make fun of them on Twitter about it, and I bring it up myself quite often. They're always like, you know, what your children will have to deal with in the future if we don't act. And I mean, I saw it with my grandmother, you know, who was I will not be putting my mother in a home, but my mother put my grandmother in an assisted living apartment, and I would get calls at, like, I remember one distinctly. It was like 1 a.m, and my grandmother called me up. She sounded confused, and she was explaining to me that she was outside an ATM with her caregiver who wanted her to withdraw money. You know, so I have seen this. They say, oh, what will happen to our children when they grow up and have to deal with this? And I'm like, all of you should be very well aware it's happening to our elderly right now. So sorry, I wanted to add that in while you were looking for the quote, because it's something that all of us should be aware of.
It's extremely real. It's happening to our elderly. It's even happening to children. All sorts. It's actually vulnerable people, people on the margins, drug addicts who are in state care facilities, all sorts of stuff like that. People who are on the margins, including elderly people, and sick people, all various types of people, people and vulnerable people. But there's just a line here. It's kind of heartbreaking. So the woman was basically the one woman was. This is how the case came to light a few years ago. She was raped by this guy. And the question now is that he may have done it to like 21 people. They're investigating 300 people over the course of his career that he was in touch with, so to speak. And they think there might have been 21, because what came out is that there had been all sorts of reports made by women in the care, and that this guy did this and that to me, and it was just fobbed off. The ambivalence. People go, oh, whatever. Just like the grooming gangs in Britain. Oh, well, that's sort of difficult, whatever, and ignored. And only when this one case burst onto the scene and came to light, they went back over all of the records, and they found that actually they had been saying it for a long time, and just ignored. So I'm just kind of reading through at random here, but his history was that he entered the state from Nigeria without a valid visa in the year 2000, before shortly afterwards lodging an application for asylum, claiming he was the victim of religious persecution. But then he withdrew his application after the Department of Justice had an opportunity to investigate its credibility after becoming a father to a child born in Ireland. So he used birthright citizenship of his child to become a resident. So basically, this guy was involved in every bullshit entry to the state. Should never have been here. He rapes women for years, and nobody takes it seriously when old ladies say, hey, that guy's been like raping me. Just ignored, apparently. And then at some point it's taken into account. There's a line here from the woman's daughter. So speaking after Adeniji was jailed for 11 years on Thursday, his victim's family described how they have been unable to comfort their mother by hugging her since the rape in April. So they're hugging her and they're not able to get her back. She's too traumatized. Imagine hugging your own grandmother to try and make her feel better, and she's not. To go back, the woman remains terrified the man will return to her room. Her daughter told the court, quote, "We always said that we will dread the day she loses her memory. But now, one day, we hope she wakes up and doesn't remember." So that's what we're talking about. It goes on. But I just want to go to another article in regard to that. So this is from Gript. So this is more recent because they've come back to it and they're realizing that there are more and more cases. So report exposed shocking failures to move against nursing home rapists in time. The report paints a depressing and sobering picture of apparent failures with regard to the sexual abuse. I just want to find you some of these quotes because they're kind of crazy. Serious failings. Sorry, I wish I had these more. Here's a quote from one person in this report, because there's been a big examination done of going over it. Quote, "It is recorded on the file of one resident, now deceased, that she had informed a carer that she was, quote, raped, and that, quote, no one believes me." A number of other residents also alleged this to the staff that they were, quote, raped and assaulted, but these complaints, according to the report, appear to have been ascribed to clinical issues such as delusions, hallucinations, delirium, confusion, or urinary tract infections. The abuse and the disregard for people who, and it's happening now, you know, it's happening for real in the real world. There's another one from today that this isn't Irish, but you know, a 14-year-old girl found dead in an apartment of an Afghan in Vienna, Austria. The girl was drugged and abused. Keith Woods has something up here. In Germany, Afghans and Africans are proportionally 40 times to 70 times more involved in gang rapes than Germans. So, of course, that's going to be true in Ireland, generally speaking, as well. There was a case where a guy called Mohammed Usman, I can't even pronounce the guy's name. These basically the people running emergency facilities for children in the country, children who don't have a home, they're poor, or not poor, but they're abandoned by parents or drug issues or whatever. These sort of marginal kids who are totally orphaned and whatever. There was it came out recently that of the top 10 private companies being paid by the state to house these children, 7 out of 10 were run by Africans and Arabs. And one of them recently, it came out that one of these Arab guys receiving millions from the state to do this was hiring people and fabricating their resumes, basically, and ignoring the vetting practices. So it's a completely Wild West. We don't know what's going on. Children go missing from state care constantly, are effectively ran around like in brothels. You know, there's this effectively the grooming gang story from England, the Rochdale type of stuff on that level. And meanwhile, you have our parents and grandparents getting raped in care homes. Like, it has very, very real consequences. Here's another one. 83% of, and this was done informally, someone looked over the names and figured out which ones are foreign and not. They had a methodology that I've seen it made sense. 83% of doctors under investigation for malpractice in Ireland are not Irish, right? So, we need them to staff our hospitals. Well, actually, they're the ones, it turns out, responsible for most of the malpractice, because of course they bring over, you know, bullshit degrees from whatever country they're from, which may or may not even be real. So, you know, it's all me just talking until you're in the hospital and it's you having something badly done to you physically because of malpractice or because of not being able to communicate with the person.
And that's something you yourself know about personally from the period that we probably shouldn't talk about. Let's just say it was a period when medical services and whether or not you had a certain status determined whether or not you could have care provided to you. I recall that you were going through some of that yourself. I want to speak very carefully about it because I've already got a channel strike in this regard, but I recall you had to confront some of that yourself.
Of course, yeah. I was, for a second there, I was like, "What the heck is he talking about?" Yeah. No, I
It's
know now.
necessary for me to be elliptical.
Yeah, I won't name or go over the details, but just another one here. This is a form of me wrapping up effectively, just to make a point. There's a thing in Ireland called Gael schools. They're Irish schools where you send your kid there, and the school is run in Irish language. You know, so they don't speak English in there. You learn mathematics and you learn geography and you learn everything, but through Irish. Irish is the spoken language in there. So instead of it being a subject in a school that you leave 14 years of school and you still can't really speak it, you know, kids in these schools really speak it. So they're a big institution in Ireland. You send your kid to a Gael school and your kid will actually speak Irish, which is pretty cool, you know. And there's a report here that found that Gael schools are being forced to use English in order to cope with the needs of Ukrainian children. So basically, our institutions are kind of falling apart, our cultural institutions, because they're being forced to accommodate these people. That's another form of, I suppose, cultural genocide to this stuff. I'm just going through my tabs here, basically, but there were a few more. There was the busiest hospital in Ireland. Obviously, it's busy because we're taking in so many people. We can't handle it. in the last couple of years, there have been 2 girls in this hospital that's known to be overran, have died. These are girls of in their teenagers, have died in hospitals. I'll just give you an example of a line. This is just the human cost, right? It's kind of what I'm getting at. The girl went in, I don't know what the ailment was, but effectively the long story short is that these people went in with like maybe breathing issues or whatever it is, and they ended up dying because the hospital was so busy that they couldn't get seen to. They were just kind of left in a room, and they end up dying. Whereas in a normal hospital that's halfway functioning, their issue would have been seen, and there was no need to die at all. It was only just because of neglect. In an acute situation, neglect leading to death, totally unnecessarily. So a couple of girls died while languishing basically on like hospital trolleys. But here's just one of the terms that so just this line gets to me. An informed source said that on arrival in the resuscitation area, the girl's condition deteriorated rapidly and her mother made increasingly anguished cries for help. So you're crying out for help. You're in a hospital. You're not at home. You're not in a field. You're in the hospital. You're going, I'm in the place where I need to get help. And you're increasingly shouting and falling apart, begging someone to come and care for your kid. And there's no one there. They're too busy, basically. There just aren't enough doctors. There are other people shouting and begging too. So like you're at like, talk about third world conditions. That's really, really bad. And it got me thinking as well, right? This is a long conclusion. It got me thinking, just like with the woman being raped, the old lady being raped by this African, being ignored. Nobody's listening to her, right? Everybody's willing to cover it up. It's like traditionally the story about Catholic priests and all of that. It's like any regime where everyone's bought in and everybody's willing to stay quiet on these things. Except I think this is maybe the worst ever, because there is no one to sort of shout stop. Like if you shout stop, you're called far right and you're banished. So like, what about the institutional people, the people writing the reports? And in this situation where one girl died a couple of years ago in this hospital needlessly because they're too busy, effectively, and then this one died recently as well again, another teenage girl, it got me thinking. The hospital after this will say, oh, we're doing an internal investigation to examine what happened and a review of practices and all of this, right? And so they will look over their SOPs and go, what could we have done differently? How could we have triaged the people better and arranged our resources and our staff a little bit better, some sort of tinkering around the edges. But what if the hospital, what if the hospital at the end, after an exhaustive investigation said that, you know what, we did as much as we could under the circumstances, and we're not here to design immigration policy, but we're here to discover what caused the death of these girls and what we could have done different. We've determined that we couldn't have really done anything as doctors or as administrators much different. We're kind of stretched that thin. At the end of the day, we're going to have to say that the root cause is that there are too many people here. And one of the tricks that they will do is that they will say they're under-resourced. We need more investment to deal with increasing demands, which is, of course, a roundabout way of sort of flipping it around. But of course, you can't invest. At a certain point, you can't invest anymore. You can't magic hospital facilities out of thin air. Even if you invest billions or whatever, the billions can't be spent. There's not enough people to build the hospital. There's not enough materials. It can't be done. The real problem is that there's too many people coming in too quickly. So, like, if the conclusion objectively for the people doing the report on why these girls died behind the scenes, if the conclusion were that the real cause was too many people and too much immigration, that has to slow down. Otherwise, more girls will die, if we're being honest. No matter how efficient we get, this is going to happen again unless the pressure is taken off us in terms of people, new people coming in. Would they say that? Or would they just say, we can't say that. Let's say something else. Let's say it's not too much demand. It's not enough investment to deal with the demand, which is bullshit. But it's easier. That way we don't have to say we don't have to shout stop. Just like in, communism or a certain, in the Stalin era of Stalin or whatever, like you can't say the certain thing you're not meant to say. So like you have to realize that all of these institutions are willing to let people get raped and to die, to let 16-year-old girls die, and let old ladies get raped, and let children get sold into prostitution to be gang raped and murdered, and all of this. A lot of these people within these institutions, because they are yes men and whatever, and because the regime is so tyrannical from the top and doesn't want to hear the truth, you're just going to get more of that, and nobody's saying anything. And you probably heard of Aisling Murphy, the woman who was killed by a Roma gypsy. Aisling Murphy, beautiful Irish girl, the epitome of everything that is good about being Irish. She was murdered in the middle of the day by this Roma. Her boyfriend came out afterwards. I don't know if the exact quotes, but he effectively said, listen, this guy should not have been here. Our immigration system is out of control. He shouldn't have been here. And I would have my girlfriend with me, probably wife by now, were she still alive. He came out and he said that, and the newspapers just ignored him. They just basically put him into a padded room and just ignored him. And, or maybe one or two of them even had the gall to probably call him far right. Like, you know, an ordinary thing would be to say, listen, if a girl is murdered and her boyfriend comes out and says something, I think the regime should sit back, you know, and listen and say, okay, let's give this person credit. Let's listen. But no, it's not allowed. Even though your girlfriend's been murdered in cold blood by our policies, you're just going to be pushed aside. And it's the same with the old ladies getting raped, and it's the same with 16-year-old girls dying in overwhelmed accident and emergency rooms. You know, it's only a matter of time until one of these things comes back to you. And I just think the carnage is very real, and it's not an ideological thing. Here's another one. The number of patients who have died, this is in Ireland, obviously, the number of patients who have died before an ambulance could reach their home has increased by 70% in the last 8 years. So people dying on their kitchen floors of some heart condition or whatever it is that, you know, were the ambulance to arrive in a time which it would have 15, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago in the past, in a memorable past, were the ambulance to arrive, they would have made it. They might have lived for another 20, 30 years. Get a little stint, you know, no big deal. Once we caught it on time. Well, someone like that might die now. 70% more over 8 years are dying because they're waiting for ambulances. You know, these things go on and on. The carnage is real. Anyway, I don't want to bleat, but that's why we're doing it. We spent a few hours talking about the political machinations of it all and stuff, and it sometimes starts to sound like a hobby or some sort of like a bunch of communist Trotskyist versus a Leninist having a debate, or, you know, this kind of stuff. It's totally real. It's totally in our faces. This is a lived reality. I'm sure it is where you're living too. It's getting crazy out there, and we, you know, so I think it's I think what we're doing and what we're discussing is very important in the real world. And there are people in hospital wards right now, perhaps like these ladies getting raped in the night and not listened to the next day, and these teenagers and these grooming victims. They need us, in a sense, because the hospital administrators aren't going to say it. They're just going to say, oh, we need more investment. It was some other issue. We'll try it better next time. The old lady's going to be ignored. They're not going to fall foul of the political correctness issue. So the only people who have any potential chance of helping them are the people who are willing to be called far right and say, fuck you, I'm going to keep going. So anyway, that's my ramble.
Yeah, I would not call it bleeding, certainly. And I would not call it a pointless ramble, because it is important, as you say, to establish. I mean, the right wing, such as it is, whatever the hell it actually is, the people within it that I have anything to do with are really, truly, they constitutionally seem to be people who just are not ideological. They don't give a shit about how you decorate it. I mean, leaving aside the, you know, the libertarians or whatever, the quote unquote libertarians. it's about what we actually are facing today, and the lamentable costs of it, you know, which you quite rightly called carnage. And yeah, I think it is important at the end of the day, as they like to say, to recognize that that is what it is about. We cannot measure well, it's the whole riff that's going around lately. You know, the purpose of the system is what it does. And in this case, we see what the system does, and therefore we know what its purpose is. The only thing that I would want to add in there, and you know, this is what I liked about you in the first place when I saw what you were doing, is that you're looking closely at these things and trying to develop strategies for it in ways that are most markedly not stupid. And so when you mention the business of framing what's going on with the hospitals, with healthcare in general, in the way that you just have, you know, what if it's really all these people are dying because period, mass immigration period. You know, if you could set that kind of story forth, you know, what occurs to me, just a last thing to leave you with, is that one could identify any number of circumstances like this that really just depend upon the framing. And things like this, like, well, they're dying in the hospitals, or they're dying before the hospital because the damn ambulance doesn't reach them, because X, right? It's this thing. The more of those that you identify that have not yet entered the discourse in that way, I would think should be carefully guarded and held close to the vest until one, not necessarily you, but you know, people who are involved in such things, I would guard them until I had a plan. You know, were it me, of course it's not me, but if I had such an idea, I would say, okay, what sort of people within the medical profession would be most likely? We know that there's all kinds of things going on with public health that make them not an ideal group to target in terms of finding people who are sympathetic. But nevertheless, they do work with people. A number of them have to care about people to have made the vocational decision that they did. You know, would it be possible for something like this to identify certain classes and types of healthcare workers who would be willing to sign on to a basic petition that just said that? You know, so I'm not saying this is necessarily the example, but as soon as you mentioned it, I'm like, well, I never heard about it. I never heard it discussed and described this way, that they're dying because they can't. I mean, people do talk, well, I can't get an appointment at the NHS, but it's never framed very, very simply. You're dying because immigration. And so, you know, as those things come up, it would seem to be something worth looking into. You know, where is a particular framing of that kind where you could get the people to sign on and just admit it? And, you know, these become new sort of mimetic chains that could be, you know, linked up and extended. Anyway, just a sort of final thought. Thank you very, very much for coming on. As you know, I've been trying to set it up for a while. We couldn't do it with the interweb connections. I'd be happy to speak with you in the future if there's anything that comes up that that you think people outside of Ireland need to know about what's going on there. I certainly recommend that everyone who is listening, please, if you're not doing it already, I imagine most of you are, please head over to GEARÓID's account on Twitter. Follow him there. You can also follow him on Telegram. It seems he's going to be streaming again here soon. So there's a YouTube channel, I would imagine, as well. Before I turn it over to you to promote any of the last things you have going on, I do want to say I'm working out the details on it. But for me, I believe it, where is it? It should be March 23rd. I hope to have well-known Germans and Austrians on the channel to talk about what's going on in the German language speaking countries in Europe, similar to what we did tonight, what we were lucky enough to hear from GEARÓID on. So that's coming up on the 23rd. Yes, and Lady of Shalott points this out in the chat. Please let us know how people who are listening can support you. So I turn it over to you with my thanks to let people know what's coming up next, to shill anything you want to shill, but very specifically, please tell people what they can do to support you.
Just follow me online, you know, find me on Twitter. I don't think people even need links and all of that. I mean, if you're interested enough to follow me, you'll find me. My name is on the screen. Just Google that, and Twitter, YouTube, and all of that. Follow me, and yeah, and I don't know, support Semiagog. It's your channel, you know. So I'm happy to be on. You know, if people follow my channel, I'm happy, and with that, and I will stream more. In fact, I might ask you to come on with me at some point to talk about, maybe even not politically, in terms of the issues we're talking about now, but I'd love to talk about America culturally. I've recently developed an interest in the Ozarks, that region, if you can call it that. You know, I'm mystified by the scale and the differences and the nature, the topography, all of that about America, and what's what, the difference between, you know, we just don't know. It's alien to us. Irish people, for the most part, and I think a lot of Europeans, we may have been to or be familiar with New York, LA, Miami, Vegas, and I don't know that I mentioned Chicago. These kind of, but like the vast hinterlands and the magic of it all. These kind of regions within the US, and maybe some politics as well. But I would love to kind of put the telescope back on you, maybe, and have a chat about it. Maybe a few
Yeah.
whiskeys as well.
Oh yeah, there's no problem with me drinking whiskey while I talk. Although I did dig into a few glasses of whiskey one year from Millennial, and I got some stink eye from Woes for, and I can't blame him. You know, it's his thing. But yes, I am always willing to drink whiskey, and I would certainly be very, very happy to come on and speak with you about whatever you like. So thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being with us. Glad to see Lady of Shalott in the house with a wrench. I'm going to have to get some more moderators in here. So yeah, it was a great pleasure to speak to GEARÓID. Please follow him. Ladies and gentlemen, keep your eye on what's coming up on the 23rd here next from me. And yeah, until next time, I am Semiagog, and I am out.